Section 1.4, Problematic Methods of Data Collection. In the previous section, we talked about methods that should be used to collect data, and we said that ideally you should be collecting your data using a simple random sample. And then we also gave some alternative methods like stratified sample, systematic sampling, and cluster sampling that are considered acceptable. But in this section, we're going to talk about some methods that cause such bad biases and problems in your data that they should always be avoided. So each of the sampling methods listed below should never be used when conducting a statistical study. The problems that arise with these are so large that they cannot be fixed by properly applying the formulas we will learn. So one of the lessons we want to learn here is that if you collect your data in a bad way, you can't fix that with math. So these are methods that if you see that they were used in a study, you want to disregard the results of those studies. The first one we'll talk about is very common. It's referred to as volunteer sampling. In this form of sampling, you allow the participants to volunteer to participate in the study, and you don't randomly choose the participants. Rather, you invite members of the population to participate, and then you take whoever comes. These are very common, and they're usually referred to as non-scientific studies. So it's common to see these when you're listening to the radio, looking at a web page, watching a TV program, and they might ask you a poll question and invite you to call in or text in or go to the web and make your vote. And this would be an example of volunteer sampling. The major problem is that such data sets are usually not representative. Some subgroups in your population are more inclined to participate than others, and the results will be biased towards their viewpoint. So typically what happens in something like this is the people that are in the minority viewpoint really want to get their voices heard, so they're more likely to vote. And sometimes people who are in the majority can be a little bit, maybe lazy because of that, and they're less inclined to take the effort to call in, text in, or go onto the online webpage to make their vote because they feel like, oh, everybody already knows my side is the winning side here. Another note that's worth making here is that when you're looking at design studies, it's very common to have people volunteer for those, so let's make a note about that. Human participants in design studies usually volunteer, and they also give their written informed consent before participating, which is an ethical consideration. In such cases, having participants volunteer does not hurt the results as long as the experiment involves randomization to deal with the possible confounding variables. So when you see that people volunteer to participate in, say, a medical study, don't feel like you have to throw out those results and think that they're not valid as long as it was a designed experiment where they randomly assigned people to the treatments. Alright, our next example or type of problematic sampling is convenience sampling, and this means that we just collect data that is easy for us to obtain. Perhaps we only survey people we know or that go to our school. We make no attempt to give every member of the population an equal chance at participating. We simply collect data from whatever sources are most convenient to us. So an example would be that a student's giving a speech in a class and they want to collect data to support his point. So he just conducts a poll among his classmates and his coworkers and his friends and his family. And the major problem is that such data sets are not representative. Those whom you normally associate with are probably more likely to have opinions similar to your own, and this would bias the study towards your point of view. And then the next problematic method is referred to as using attention-getting data. This occurs when something that regularly produces data suddenly produces data that stands out as unusual. You don't normally do statistical studies on this thing, but because the data seems so strange to you, you decide to conduct a study based on this data set. So an example of this would be a regular gambler notices that a roulette wheel has produced a red number on 10 consecutive plays of the game. and she uses this result to show that the wheel is biased towards the red numbers. And the major problem here is that it is normal for a random experiment to occasionally produce what appears to be unusual results if we observe this experiment over a long time period. And while this data is random to some extent, we have decided to only use the portion of the data that stood out as unusual, and this will severely bias our study towards proving, in quotes, our result. Most likely the roulette wheel will just fall back into more normal patterns if we continue to observe it. Let's continue our discussion by looking at a couple more forms of problematic data collection. One of those would be using pre-existing data. This occurs anytime you collect and examine a data set before you decide what you're going to prove from that data. For example, a person tosses a coin 100 times and it lands showing the head side 63 times, and the person decides to use this data to show that the coin is biased towards heads. So the major problem here is if the data gives us our opinion, then the data will automatically be biased towards supporting that opinion. It's fine to get an idea of what you want to prove by using data that has been randomly selected. However, once you have come up with what you want to show, you must take a new random sample to try and prove your point rather than using the data that formed that opinion in your mind in the first place. So for example, with our coin here, what we should have done was just probably check to see if the coin was biased towards heads or tails. But by flipping it first and getting the opinion that it was heads, that makes it actually more likely that we'll make a mistake. It would have been okay to look at just heads if we got our opinion from these first 100 tosses, but we need a new 100 tosses as our data to test that theory. Let's go ahead and look at the final problematic method that we're going to discuss in this section, which is handpicking your data. This is a method where you purposely seek out data that meets a certain criteria, or you might remove data that does not. So some examples here would be choosing data from a top 10 or top 40 list, examining only the results from the best performer or the worst performer on a test, a game, a sport, etc., or, worst of all, throwing out data that doesn't fit your theory. It's actually fine to look at such a list, but you should never consider this to be a representative sample of your population. Such data sets should be seen as populations themselves. Study them if you want to, but do not try to make inferences about the larger group they were selected from. In the case of throwing out data that doesn't fit your theory, now you are purposely distorting your data in a way that helps to prove your point, and I would consider that to be completely unethical. Let's go ahead and look at a couple of examples here and try and see if we can spot the problematic method that was used, and then think about what biases that might cause. So in each of the following examples, criticize the sampling techniques used in each of the following and explain what bias it might create in the results of your study. In 1948, the Kinsey Report on Sexual Behaviors was published, and the statements of this report were treated as facts for decades. However, his sample contained a high percentage of prison inmates and known sex offenders. For example, convicted criminals comprised a full 25% of Kinsey's male sample, though they made up only 1% of the total U.S. population at the time. So I wasn't there. I don't know what Kinsey's thought process was for why he decided to use so many criminals. The twisted side would be if this was intentional, but I'm going to give him the benefit of the doubt here and say that he probably just did it because he had access to those prisoners and somebody told them they would have the prisoners take the survey for him, and that just means that it was awfully convenient for him to use those people. It used to be that people would think, hey, if I have a big sample, that's really going to be helpful. So if somebody had access to a lot of prisoners that could do their survey, that would be really appealing to them just based on the numbers. So I'm going to go ahead and say that the problem here is that he used convenient sampling. And then as far as the biases go, I won't get into any specific things, but because we have 25% of the male sample is convicted criminals, we're going to be biased towards whatever sexual behaviors those people have. So our results are going to be biased towards the sexual behaviors of convicted criminals. Alright, and then one final example from this section. After 16 games were played in the 2007 baseball season, New York Yankee Alex Rodriguez led the majors in home runs with 12 home runs. Using these 16 games as the sample, it's estimated that he will hit 122 home runs by the end of the 162 game season. Now the math on this is actually correct. We're just doing some proportion work and saying 12 is to 16 games as X is to 162 games and doing the math and getting 122. So it's not the math that's in question here, it's the sampling technique. So what we want to think about is, why did we choose Alex Rodriguez? And I think that that's listed right here. It says we chose him because he led the majors in home runs. So we're using the top performer, and if you look back at the definition, that falls right into the category of handpicking your data. So the most likely thing I would say here is that the problematic sampling method using is handpicked data. Now, not only was he leading the majors, but to have those 12 home runs in 16 games is actually kind of unusual. So I think it would also be reasonable to say maybe that data caught people's attention and that's why they decided to use it. So I would say that you could list attention getting data, and that would be a reasonable option as well. And you wouldn't have to list both of these. You could pick either one of these and give it as your answer, and that would be fine. And then anytime you do this, if it's attention getting data, it's going to be biased towards that unusual result. And in this case, we handpicked him because he led the majors, so I would say this is going to be biased towards an unusually large home run total. Okay, finally we're going to end this section by looking at a couple of topics that also cause concern with studies or data that has been collected. One of these is loaded questions, and that is a survey question that has been worded in such a way that it favors one answer over others. So, for an example, a recent poll asked the following question: do you agree with most Americans that the super rich should have their taxes raised so they can start paying their fair share? Explain why this should be considered a loaded question. So the quick answer is that it favors the answer yes. I think if you wanted to get deeper into it, you would look at some phrases like, do you agree with? Anytime you use the phrase, do you agree with, you're kind of encouraging people to agree with you, so you're encouraging a yes answer right there. And you're saying most Americans. Most people want to be in the majority, so if you're telling them that most people feel this way, that's also encouraging them to join that side. And then I think that's compounded by not just referring to them as the wealthier Americans, but the super rich. And that implies almost, just this extravagant amount of money. And then the fact that we're saying so they could start paying their fair share, of course we want things to be fair. So if we're implying that currently the system is not fair, that's encouraging people to be in favor of a change. So what would be better language for a poll question on this matter? You might want to pause the video here for a second and try and fill this in on your own just to see what you come up with. One possible answer that I would give here is Do you support raising taxes on the top 5% of wage earners? So in this wording, we've gotten rid of the do you agree with and the most Americans part. We're not referring to them as the super rich now. We're calling them the top 5% of wage earners, and we've just gotten rid of that idea of whether it's fair or not. And then the top 5%, I'm just making that number up, but if the legislation that was currently being proposed was top 5%, we should say that. If it was top 10% or 1%, we should say that. We should probably just try and have wording that agrees with the legislation that we're trying to see if people are in favor of. All right, the final topic in this section is suspicious sources. And this is when those conducting or funding the study have a vested interest in a certain result. It's actually very common that when a pharmaceutical study is being done, that the company who has developed that drug is the one that is funding or paying for that research. And so there's always a little bit of a question in people's mind, like, wow, if they paid for that, then maybe they're just paying the people to come up with the result that they want. Generally, those studies are paid for by those people, but they also have independent people doing the test, and that's kind of a required part for it to get approval, that you pay for it, but then you stand back and you just let the testing be done. Let's go ahead and look at an example of suspicious sources. In 2010, the Jenny Craig weight loss system ran an ad comparing their program to Weight Watchers, and the commercial claimed that a study had shown that Jenny Craig clients lost on average over twice as much weight as those on the largest weight loss program. So why would this be considered a suspicious source for this information? And right away I would say, well, this is a commercial. It's an ad trying to get us to buy something as opposed to a news article that's just reporting this. And that makes it suspicious to me because Jenny Craig has a financial interest in my believing that result and buying her product. So let's go ahead and write that down. So it's a commercial for Jenny Craig. Not a news article. Or news story. Maybe you could say it doesn't matter if it's print or radio or whatever. And then what we're concerned about is that Jenny Craig has a financial interest in our believing this result. And then the final question, does the fact that it's suspicious mean that the claim's not true? No, that's not the case. So when it's suspicious, that just means that we're a little worried about it. It seems a little fishy that the source is the person who's trying to sell us on this program. So if this was something you were interested in and you really wanted to think about is this true or not, I wouldn't go just by what I heard in the commercial. I would see if I could look up the results of that study and see the details, see how it was conducted, who conducted it, was it an independent company, does it seem like they had a random sample or that they had a well-designed study. Those sort of details should be looked into. So all I would write here for this answer is it does this mean it's not a true claim? No. And then what's my reasoning behind that? If the result is important to you, then you should investigate the details of the study further. So if it's a suspicious source, don't throw it out right away, but do investigate it if it's something that matters to you. And then just a quick note up here, it says that if you do find any suspicious sources or loaded questions or bad sampling techniques being used, then I'll give you extra credit for that. So generally what you'd want to do to get that extra credit is print out a news article on that study and then highlight the details of the suspicious source or the loaded question or the bad sampling technique, and then just maybe write a sentence or two about why you think it's a suspicious source, why you feel the question is loaded, why is it a bad sampling technique, and then as long as I agree with you on that, I'll give you the extra credit. You can just turn those in to me in class time.